The sky over the Pacific in early 1942 was a slaughterhouse. The established strategic order, the very balance of air power, had been shattered not by overwhelming numbers, but by a single, revolutionary machine, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. This aircraft was more than a technological marvel. It was the razor-sharp embodiment of Japanese imperial ambition, and it was sweeping Allied air power from the skies. At 7:32 a.m. on February 10th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, call sign Jimmy, watched this terrifying reality diving toward his 4F Wildcats over Wake Island. He knew his pilots had maybe 90 seconds before they died. Thatch was 37 years old, a veteran with 214 flight hours in the Wildcat, but he had 0 kills against the Phantom-like Zeros. The Japanese had dispatched 18 of their elite fighters to sweep the American patrols from the morning sky. The confrontation represented a horrifying crisis of industrial philosophy. Thatch's Wildcat was slower. The Zero climbed faster, turned tighter, and could outmaneuver any American fighter at any altitude. The Zero was an exquisite weapon, built without compromise for offensive performance. It sacrificed armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and pilot survivability for unparalleled range and agility. The American Grumman F4F Wildcat was its antithesis, a product of the Grumman Iron Works. It was a heavy, rugged, armored brawler designed to absorb catastrophic punishment and, most critically, bring its pilot home. But in the lethal turning battles of early 1942, this industrial philosophy of endurance was failing. Agility was defeating survivability. Japanese pilots knew it. American pilots knew it. The math was simple and brutal. A Zero could outturn a Wildcat in 14 seconds. 14 seconds to get on your tail. 14 seconds to line up guns. 14 seconds to kill you. By February, the Pacific Fleet had lost 43 Wildcats in 1 versus 1 dogfights with Zeros. 43 pilots who tried to turn with Zeros. 43 funerals. This number, 43, was more than a human tragedy. It was a catastrophic strategic drain. In 1942, the single most valuable and irreplaceable asset in the American war machine wasn't steel, oil, or even aircraft carriers. It was the trained naval aviator. Each pilot represented thousands of hours and a fortune in training resources. Losing them at this rate was a form of economic attrition the U.S. war economy could not sustain. The industrial base could replace the planes, but it could not replace the experience at the speed the Zeros were erasing it. The pattern never changed. American pilot sees Zero. American pilot turns to engage. Zero outturns him. Zero shoots him down. Command, locked in doctrinal paralysis, kept sending the same orders. Avoid turning engagements. Run if possible. But running meant abandoning other pilots. Running meant letting Zeros strafe your buddies while you fled. Thatch commanded Fighting Squadron 3. 4 pilots, 4 Wildcats, 4 men who trusted him to keep them alive. But he had no answer for the Zero's turn radius. No answer for its climb rate. No answer except to watch good men die. 3 days earlier, Thatch had sat in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego, staring at a pack of matches. His wife had sent them in a care package. 20 wooden matches in a thin cardboard box. He'd been thinking about the Zero problem for weeks. He wasn't just fighting the Zero, he was fighting a century of established doctrine. The entire edifice of Western air combat was built on the legacy of World War I. The Knight of the Sky, the lone ace in a one-on-one duel. This romantic ideal was now a death sentence. How do you beat an enemy who can outturn you? How do you survive when the enemy is faster, more agile, and flown by battle-hardened pilots with 2 years of combat experience? Thatch picked up 2 matches, held them parallel. Then he moved them in opposite directions, weaving them past each other. The matches crossed again, never separated, always supporting each other. And something clicked in his brain. What if 2 Wildcats didn't fight independently? What if they flew as a pair, weaving back and forth?
The diagram clearly illustrates
if a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They'd cross paths, and the Zero chasing the first Wildcat would fly directly into the second Wildcat's guns. It was insane. It violated every fighter doctrine in the U.S. Navy manual. Fighters fought alone. Pairs stayed together for navigation, but when combat started, you split up and fought 1 versus 1. That was how air combat worked. That was how every pilot had been trained since 1918. But Thatch couldn't stop seeing those matches weaving together. Couldn't stop thinking about 43 dead pilots. He'd called his wingman, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, into his quarters that night, showed him the matches, explained the weave. O'Hare stared at the matches for 30 seconds. Then he looked at Thatch and asked one question. When do we test it? 4 days later, Thatch was about to find out if his matchstick trick would save lives or get 4 pilots killed. The 6 Zeros were 1,200 yards out and closing fast. His hand moved to the radio. Time to try something that had never been done in combat. Time to find out if 2 matches could beat 6 Zeros. Thatch's voice cracked across the radio, cutting through the high-altitude hiss and the thrum of the engines. Weave on my mark. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 800 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, piloted by Ensigns Daniel Sheedy and Edgar Colson, flew another 1,000 feet beyond Bassett. 4 American fighters in a loose, vulnerable line, facing 18 Zeros. 6 of those Zeros were now diving from 11,000 feet, streaks of silver and red against the deep Pacific blue. Standard doctrine said, split up, turn independently, fight alone. It was the doctrine of the lone ace, the Knight of the Sky. It was the doctrine that had resulted in 43 funerals. Thatch keyed his radio and gave an order that was nothing short of heresy. An order that had never been spoken in U.S. Navy combat. Bassett on me. Weave. Pattern. Execute. Bassett, trusting his commander implicitly, turned his Wildcat toward Thatch. Thatch turned toward Bassett. They flew directly at each other. From the cockpits of the diving Zeros. This was incomprehensible. The Japanese pilots, supremely confident in their machines and their own individual prowess, probably thought the Americans were panicking. They were witnessing what could only be a fatal mistake. A mid-air collision born of sheer terror. But Thatch and Bassett didn't collide. At 400 yards, both pilots banked hard. Thatch pulled left. Bassett pulled right. They crossed paths with 200 feet of separation, their wingtips a blur to each other. Then they kept turning. coming around to cross again. A defensive figure-8 pattern. Two aircraft weaving back and forth like those matches on Thatch's desk, bound by an invisible thread of mutual support. The lead Zero pilot, committed to the attack, picked Bassett. This was standard Zero tactic. Isolate one target, close with superior maneuverability, and hammer it with 20mm cannon fire. The Zero pilot probably expected Bassett to try turning with him, a fatal error. But Bassett didn't turn away from the Zero. He turned toward Thatch. The Zero followed, lining up guns. 500 yards. 400 yards. The Japanese pilot had Bassett centered in his gun sight, his thumb hovering over the firing stud, perhaps 3 seconds from an easy kill. Then Thatch's Wildcat came screaming through the weave pattern from the opposite direction. The Zero pilot suddenly had a new, terrifying problem. He was chasing Bassett, but Bassett was flying directly toward another Wildcat. And that Wildcat had 6 .50 caliber machine guns pointed straight at him. The hunter had become the hunted. Thatch had just imposed an impossible lose-lose dilemma on the enemy. The Zero pilot had one choice: break off the attack or fly into a wall of bullets. Thatch opened fire at 300 yards. 70 rounds per second of .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiaries tore through the air. The Zero pilot flinched. He broke off, pulling hard right, climbing away in a desperate maneuver. The other 5 Zeros, seeing their leader suddenly disengage and the tactical geometry completely inverted, scattered. For the first time in the Pacific War, Zeros were running from Wildcats. Sheehy and Coulson had watched the weave work. Now they tried it. Sheehy turned toward Coulson. Coulson turned toward Sheehy. 2 more Wildcats weaving. Another Zero committed to Coulson's tail, got to 400 yards. Then Sheehy came through the weave. And the Zero pilot, having just seen what happened to his leader, flinched, pulled up, and disengaged. The dogfight lasted 6 minutes. 6 Japanese Zeros versus 4 American Wildcats. The standard outcome should have been 4 dead Americans. But when the Zeros finally climbed away and headed northwest, all 4 Wildcats were still flying. Thatch checked his fuel, checked his wingmen. Nobody hit, nobody killed. The weave had worked. Thatch landed at Ford Island 40 minutes later. His hands were shaking, not just from fear, but from the profound, earth-shattering adrenaline of a confirmed hypothesis. It was the thrill of intellectual discovery.
The pilot's hands tremble.
Maybe,
a visceral reaction
just
to the
maybe,
G-force and the immense
American
pressure of the
pilots
bombing
didn't
run.
have to die every time they met Zeros. But Fighter Command wasn't convinced. Thatch filed his combat report that afternoon, described the weave, explained how it worked, recommended immediate adoption across all fighter squadrons. He had delivered the solution to the Zero problem. The response came back 3 days later. Interesting tactic.
There it is.
Needs further testing. Not
The weave
approved
is
for
the
widespread
solution to
use.
the Zero problem.
Thatch stared at that response for a long time. 43 pilots dead in February, and Command wanted more testing. This was the crushing weight of institutional inertia, a bureaucracy so invested in its pre-war doctrine that it could not recognize the revolution staring it in the face. Command was still waiting for a better plane, not a better idea. Meanwhile, the Japanese were planning something bigger. Something that would test the weave against odds no fighter pilot had ever faced. Because in 68 days, Thatch would be flying over a tiny island called Midway. Between February and June 1942, Thatch's matchstick trick remained a piece of unsanctioned, heretical doctrine. Fighter Command wanted more tests, more data, more committee meetings. But Thatch was at war, and his men were dying. He trained Fighting Squadron 3 on the Weave every single day. Morning flights, afternoon flights, night formations. When the moon was bright enough, his pilots flew the pattern until they could execute it blind, until the complex, interwoven movements became pure muscle memory. Turn toward your wingman, cross, turn back, cross again. Simple in theory, brutal in practice at 300 miles per hour with the imagined terror of zeros on your tail. The Navy still hadn't officially approved the tactic, but Thatch didn't wait for approval. He taught it to every pilot who would listen, becoming an evangelist for a doctrine of survival. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams on blackboards, explained the geometry. This was not just a tactic, it was a fundamental shift in combat philosophy. For 25 years, the cult of the ace dominated air power. Victory was individual. Thatch's Weave was the antithesis. Victory was mutual. It was a system, not a man. If a zero commits to your tail, you turn into your wingman. The zero is then forced to choose: follow you directly into your wingman's guns or break off. Either way, you survive. Some veteran pilots, steeped in the old ways, thought Thatch was crazy. One squadron commander told him the Weave violated basic fighter doctrine. You can't fly toward another friendly aircraft in combat. You'll collide, you'll panic, you'll get both pilots killed. But Thatch kept teaching, because pilots kept dying. By May, the official tally was horrifying. The Pacific Fleet had lost 91 Wildcats in combat with zeros, 91 funerals, 91 letters to families, and Fighter Command, gripped by doctrinal paralysis, still issued the same orders. Avoid engagement when possible. Run if outnumbered. The orders might as well have said, give up and die. Then, in a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, the entire strategic landscape shifted. Naval intelligence, specifically the codebreakers at Station Hypo, achieved the impossible. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team, working themselves to the point of collapse, had broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They decrypted a flurry of messages. The Japanese were planning a massive assault on an objective codenamed AF. American commanders in Washington believed AF was in the South Pacific, or perhaps even the West Coast. But Rochefort was convinced AF was Midway Island.
The strategic heart of
to
the
prove
Pacific
it,
defense was Midway
he had the
itself.
Midway garrison broadcast a fake, unencrypted message that their water desalination plant had broken. Days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message. AF is short on fresh water. The trap was set. The decrypted messages revealed the Japanese plan: a massive assault on Midway. 4 fleet aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, over 270 aircraft, the largest carrier operation in Japanese naval history. The attack was scheduled for June 4th, 1942. Admiral Chester Nimitz, now armed with Rochefort's priceless intelligence, called every available carrier to Pearl Harbor. He had 3. Enterprise and Hornet were available. But the Yorktown, his third, was limping back from the Battle of the Coral Sea, grievously wounded. Shipyard estimators said she needed 3 months of repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. 1,400 workers swarmed the carrier, patching her hull, rewiring her systems, working around the clock. She was a wounded, bleeding animal, but she was a third carrier. Fighting Squadron 3 got deployment orders on May 26th. Report to USS Yorktown. Prepare for carrier operations. Thatch read those orders and understood what they meant. His squadron would be flying combat air patrol over Yorktown when the Japanese attacked, protecting the carrier, fighting Zeros, maybe dying. He gathered his pilots that evening. 7 men, 7 Wildcats, 7 lives depending on a trick with matches that the Navy still hadn't approved. Thatch showed them the matches one more time, explained the weave one more time. Then he told them the truth. The Japanese are bringing 50 Zeros to Midway. Maybe more. We'll have 8 Wildcats. Maybe fewer if Enterprise or Hornet lose fighters before the battle. The only way we survive is the weave. The only way we protect Yorktown is the weave.
With battle damage patched,
the only way
the
we
USS
win
Yorktown heads
is the
west,
weave.
determined to
One
meet the
pilot
enemy.
asked the obvious question: what if it doesn't work? What if we weave and the Zeros just shoot us anyway? Thatch didn't have a good answer. He just showed them the matches again. Showed them how 2 matches weaving could cover each other, could protect each other, could survive together when surviving alone was impossible. Yorktown sailed from Pearl Harbor on May 30th. 4 days to Midway. 4 days to prepare for a battle that would decide the Pacific War. 4 days to pray that a matchstick trick would work when 50 Zeros came screaming out of the sky. June 4th,
The carrier Yorktown, hastily repaired, sails into the teeth of the enemy.
1,042.
Her planes stand ready on the patched
0930
flight deck.
hours. The air at 14,000 feet above the USS Yorktown was cold, thin, and humming with a
Warning,
terrible
multiple contacts
electric
bearing
tension.
320. Enemy
This was the
fighters
moment the
closing
code
fast.
breakers
All
at Station
squadrons,
Hypo had
engage.
predicted. This was the moment the Yorktown, a carrier literally raised from the dead by 1,400 shipyard workers in a 72-hour miracle, had sailed for. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading his tiny 4-plane section of Wildcats, was the fragile shield for the entire American carrier fleet. And then, against the vast emptiness of the Pacific Blue, they appeared. The first
enemy Zeros
Japanese
positioned at
strike
15,000
wave.
feet,
Not the
utilized
50
their height
Zeros
advantage to
intelligence
initiate a
had warned of
devastating
not
dive on
yet,
the Wildcats'
but a terrifying formation nonetheless. 18 Aichi Val, dive bombers, the carrier killers, escorted by 12 Mitsubishi Zeros. The math was still a nightmare. 3-to-1 odds against Thatch's section. The Zeros came in high, 15,000 feet. This was standard Japanese doctrine, honed over China and Pearl Harbor. Establish altitude advantage, dive on the slower American fighters, and use superior speed and agility to dominate the fight. They were the undisputed masters of this lethal, 3-dimensional ballet. Thatch counted the enemy aircraft, counted his own. 4 Wildcats, 12 Zeros. His hand keyed the radio, his voice cutting through the static. Weave pattern. Execute on my mark. His wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Bassett, was 600 feet to his right. 2 more Wildcats, flown by Ensigns Shee and Coulson, flew behind them. The Zeros dove, splitting to engage. Thatch watched them commit, watched them pick their targets. 3 Zeros broke
The
toward
maneuver is
Thatch.
executed flawlessly,
4 went
causing
after
immediate
Bassett.
confusion among the enemy
The others,
formation.
supremely confident their fighter escort had the situation handled, continued their dive toward the Yorktown. Thatch gave the order, "Mark! Execute!" He turned hard toward Bassett. Bassett turned toward him. They crossed paths at 12,000 feet. From the cockpits of the diving Zeros, this was incomprehensible.
As you can see,
It was the same panicked, suicidal maneuver they had seen before. The lead Zero chasing Thatch hesitated for just 2 seconds. But 2 seconds at combat speed is 400 yards. It was a fatal pause. A moment of cognitive dissonance where his superior training and doctrine failed him. He was expecting a duel. He was met with a system. Thatch came through the weave and opened fire. His 6.50 caliber guns erupted. The rounds ripped through the Zero's engine cowling. The Zero rolled left, trailing black smoke, and fell away.
The red markers
Thatch's first
indicate the split
Zero
attack.
kill. But the victory was short-lived. These were not rookies from a training squadron. They were elite, battle-hardened veterans. The other 2 Zeros on Thatch's tail didn't break off. They had seen the weave, understood the geometry instantly, and they adapted. This was the nightmare scenario. Instead of committing to Thatch's tail as a single unit, they split. One went high, one went low. They executed a bracket attack, forcing the weave to defend against 2 threats from different altitudes simultaneously. The weave, this brilliant new doctrine, was being countered in its first major test. The geometry was broken. Thatch had to choose which threat to counter. He pulled into a climbing turn toward the high Zero. Bassett broke toward the low Zero. The weave pattern fractured. For 6 critical seconds, the mutual support was broken. Both Wildcats were fighting independently. It was exactly what Thatch had tried to avoid. The very doctrine that had gotten 91 pilots killed. The high Zero got guns on Thatch at 800 yards. Explosive 20mm cannon fire walked up Thatch's left wing. 2 shells punched through the wing root. Another went through his cockpit canopy, shattering the plexiglass just 3 inches from his head. Thatch felt the shock wave, felt aluminum fragments sting his flight suit. He kept turning. Just then, Bassett's voice screamed over the radio. "I'm hit." Repeat.
The weave principle
"I'm hit."
demonstrates how Thatch,
Thatch
perceiving
looked
the
left.
threat to Bassett,
Bassett's
maneuvers
Wildcat was
preemptively
trailing
to
white
neutralize
smoke.
the attack vector.
A coolant leak. Maybe worse. The low Zero was still on his tail, hammering him with machine gun fire. Thatch made a choice. It was the choice that defined his entire philosophy. He abandoned his turn toward the high Zero, threatening his own life. He dove toward Bassett. The formation of the weave had broken, but the principle still worked. Get between your wingman and the threat. Thatch came down on the low Zero from 7 o'clock high. 600 yards, 500, 400. He opened fire. The Zero exploded. A cloud of metal and fire. Pieces of its wing and fuselage tumbled through the air. Bassett's Wildcat was shaking, losing altitude, but flying. He called over the radio. "Engines overheating. I'm heading back to Yorktown," Thatch told him. "Go." He then ordered the other 2 Wildcats to escort Bassett home. Protecting the carrier was the primary mission, but protecting the pilots was Thatch's personal creed. Bassett was safe, but the cost of this decision was immediate and terrifying. That left Thatch alone at 11,000 feet with 10 Zeros still in the sky. The weave worked with a wingman. Without a wingman, Thatch was just another Wildcat pilot. a statistic waiting to happen. He was back to being the man in the armored coffin, facing an enemy he could not outrun and could not outturn. He turned toward Yorktown, starting his descent. 3 Zeros saw him, broke from their patrol, and turned to intercept. Thatch looked for friendly fighters. He saw 4 Wildcats from another squadron 3 miles east, too far to help. The 3 Zeros were closing. Thatch had no wingmen, no weave, and no options except to run. But running meant leading 3 Zeros directly toward the Yorktown, leading them to the very carrier his squadron was supposed to protect. He keyed his radio, called for help, told the other Wildcats he was engaging 3 Zeros solo. Then, John Thatch turned his Wildcat toward the 3 Zeros and prepared to find out if the principle of the matchstick trick could save one pilot's life. Thatch was at 9,000 feet when the 3 Zeros reached firing range. He was alone. No wingman to weave with, no support, no one to execute the complex geometry of mutual defense. But he had spent 4 months thinking about nothing but the weave. 4 months living inside its geometry. And in that moment of extreme duress, he had a profound realization. The weave didn't strictly require 2 aircraft. It required 2 points in space. It was a principle of energy and vectors, not just a formation. He could become both points. He turned hard right, a maneuver the Zeros expected. A maneuver that should have sealed his fate. The lead Zero committed, pulling in behind him to follow the turn. But Thatch was already reversing, banking hard left. A brutal, high-G reversal. The Zero pilot, anticipating a continuous turn, was now out of position. He had to correct, had to pull harder, had to burn precious energy to get his guns back on target. Thatch did it again.
The Zeros, unable
A
to hold
sharp
their
right
position,
turn,
executed a
followed
sharp
by an
disengagement.
immediate left
They are now
reversal.
in full retreat,
The
attempting
Zero
to climb and
followed
escape the
right.
theater of battle.
Thatch went left.
The other 2 red
The
dots,
Japanese
seeing
pilot,
their leader
despite
flee,
his superior
also break off
aircraft,
and animate
was
away,
always half a
following
second
him.
behind, always reacting to Thatch, never acting. And every one of these violent corrections cost speed, cost energy,
This is
cost
the
the
dreaded
altitude
scissors
advantage.
A chaotic
This
and
was not a
unpredictable
graceful
signature of the
dogfight.
enemy's movements.
This was a desperate, ugly, intellectual brawl. After 40 seconds of these constant reversals, what pilots would later call the scissors, the Zero was co-altitude with Thatch. Same speed, same energy state. No advantage. The Zero pilot, his tactical playbook rendered useless, broke off and climbed away. The other 2 Zeros, seeing their leader abandon the fight, followed him. Thatch had just proven something critical. The weave principle worked even without a wingman. Sharp reversals, constant direction changes. Never let the enemy predict your next move. Make them react. Make them bleed energy. Make them quit. He landed on the Yorktown 20 minutes later. Bassett was already aboard. His Wildcat riddled with 4 hits, but the engine had held together long enough to reach the carrier. The other pilots from Fighting Squadron 3 were debriefing in the ready room. They had all seen it. They had watched from a distance as Thatch's single Wildcat engaged 3 Zeros and survived. Word spread through the fighter squadrons that afternoon like wildfire. Thatch's weave works. It works in pairs, and the principle of it works even solo. By evening, pilots from the Enterprise and Hornet were coming over, asking Thatch to explain the tactic. This was not a top-down order from command. This was a bottom-up revolution, a viral idea spreading through the fleet, driven by the most powerful motivator: Survival. He showed them the matches, drew diagrams on a chalkboard, demonstrated the reversals. Some pilots tested it that night, pair flights over the carrier groups, practicing the weave, learning the timing. By June 5th, 18 Wildcat pilots could execute the pattern. By June 6th, 32 pilots. The weave was spreading through the fleet faster than any official doctrine ever had.
Change
And
their
the
methods.
Japanese noticed.
Expect increased resistance.
They were a learning, adapting enemy. Naval intelligence began intercepting Japanese radio traffic from June 7th that included baffled references to new American tactics. American fighters flying in coordinated pairs. American fighters executing unpredictable,
As the Zeros
rapid
approach,
reversal
the Wildcats
maneuvers.
shift into the two-plane
American
weave,
fighters
a
that
tactic would
refused to
soon
die.
change the course of aerial
One
combat.
intercepted message from a Japanese fighter commander
As
said,
demonstrated here, the
American
synchronized weave
Wildcat
holds firm.
pilots
The attacking
have
Zeros
changed
attempt to
their
penetrate the
methods.
screen, but
Expect increased resistance. The weave was no longer a secret. On June 10th, Fighting Squadron 3 flew combat air patrol over a convoy near Midway. 8 Wildcats, 14 Zeros attacked. Thatch called the weave. All 4 pairs executed. The Zeros tried their standard tactics, tried to isolate individual Wildcats, tried to use superior maneuverability. But every time a Zero committed to a Wildcat's tail, that Wildcat turned toward his wingman. Every time the Zeros tried to split a pair, both Wildcats turned toward each other. The pattern held. After 12 minutes, the Zeros broke off. They had damaged 2 Wildcats, but scored 0 kills. The Americans had shot down 3 Zeros, 3 confirmed kills. This was the data point that shattered the bureaucracy. For the first time in the Pacific combat, Wildcats had a positive kill ratio against Zeros in a major engagement. Fighter Command finally took notice. On June 15th, Commander John Thatch received orders to report to Pearl Harbor.
When the signal is given,
Report
the
to
scissors
Admiral
cut must
Nimitz.
be executed precisely
Prepare a
here.
formal briefing on the weave tactic. The Navy wanted to evaluate whether this matchstick trick should become official doctrine. Thatch arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 18th. He spent 2 days preparing the briefing, gathering diagrams, combat footage, pilot testimonials, kill ratios, survival statistics, everything command needed to see that the weave worked. But while Thatch was preparing his briefing, Japanese intelligence was preparing something else. They had analyzed the new American tactics. They had studied the weave pattern, and they had developed a counter-tactic. A way to break the weave. A way to kill both Wildcats at once. On June 23rd, Fighting Squadron 3 would face 18 Zeros over Santa Cruz
18
Island.
inbound bogies
And
were
those
tracked
Zeros would be
moving
using
southeast,
tactics
crossing the
specifically
12-mile
designed to
threshold
destroy
towards
the
fleet.
Thatch Weave. June 23rd, 1942, 081, 5 hours, over the Santa Cruz Islands. Fighting Squadron 3 was flying convoy escort
The weave,
when the
once
radar
thought
operator
impenetrable,
called out
was
contacts.
systematically broken down as
18
the
bogies
analysis
inbound
revealed
from the
critical weaknesses
northwest.
in the enemy's strategy.
Distance 12 miles. This was not a random encounter. This was a calculated, deliberate response. The Japanese, an intelligent and adaptive enemy, had analyzed their failures at Midway. They had studied the reports from their pilots. They had deconstructed the geometry of this new American crossing tactic. And now they were here to test their counter. Thatch counted his Wildcats. 8 aircraft, 4 pairs, flying in the standard weave formation. He had briefed Admiral Nimitz just 3 days earlier. Now, he was about to discover that Japanese Imperial General Headquarters had done its homework too. The Zeros came in at 16,000 feet, but they didn't dive immediately. They circled, an ominous, patient orbit. Thatch watched them
Here
for
we
90
observe the
seconds.
weave formation.
This was
Defensive
wrong.
capabilities are restricted solely to
Zeros
the
always
X-axis,
attacked
leaving the
immediately.
vertical approach exposed.
Always used their altitude advantage before the heavy Wildcats could climb. But these Zeros were waiting. They were coordinating. Then, in a terrifying display of tactical precision, the formation split. 6 Zeros broke left. 6 broke right. 6 stayed high. 3 groups. 3 angles of attack. The Japanese had developed a doctrine to break the doctrine. They had correctly analyzed that the Weave was a binary, two-dimensional defensive system. 2 Wildcats could protect each other from one direction, perhaps 2. But what about 3 directions simultaneously?
Bassett's pair,
This
Blue
was a
1,
tactic designed
demonstrates
to
the maneuver,
induce
turning
catastrophic
sharply
cognitive
upward to
overload,
engage the high
to break
red
the
threat.
pairs by presenting too many threats for the human brain to process. They were attacking the decision-making of the pilots, not just their aircraft. The attack
Bassett's
came
squadron,
at
Blue 1, was in
0817.
peril, but Sheehy's
A
pair,
coordinated,
Blue 2, spotted the
multi-axis
incoming threat and
assault.
When Blue 2 breaks
6 diving
formation to
from
aid
high.
Bassett, the tactical
6
weave
sweeping
is
in
severed,
from the left
marking a
flank.
critical failure in the
6
squadron's
from the
cohesion.
right. A 3-dimensional wall of 20 millimeters cannon fire. Thatch called the Weave, but his pilots hesitated. Which threat do you counter? Which way do you turn? Lieutenant Bassett, reacting instinctively, chose the high Zeros and turned into them. But this fatal choice exposed his right flank to the right side group. Ensign Sheehy saw the danger and turned to cover Bassett's right, but in doing so, he broke the weave pattern with his own wingmen. For a terrible moment, the system collapsed. The pairs fragmented. 8 Wildcats were suddenly fighting independently. It was exactly what the Japanese wanted. It was the pre-Midway slaughter. Returned. Thatch saw it happening. Saw his entire doctrine dissolving into chaos. He keyed his radio, his voice cutting through the panic. Reform pairs!
By trusting the
Lock
system
onto your
and executing
wingmen!
the weave,
Execute
the right group is
standard weave!
neutralized, while
Ignore the
flanks
other
remain
groups!
secure.
This last command was an act of profound tactical genius. He wasn't telling them to fight 18 Zeros. He was telling them to fight 1 Zero, the one their wingman was defending against. He was ordering them to trust the system, not their instincts. His pilots heard him. Bassett turned hard toward his wingman, found him, locked in. They executed the weave. The high Zeros dove. Bassett turned toward his wingman. The Zeros followed and flew directly into his wingman's guns. 2 Zeros
The red group
exploded.
advances, but the blue
The
3
others pulled
executes
up,
the weave. The
shocked.
trap flashes,
The
compelling
left
the
group
enemy to
tried
break
next.
off and retreat.
Thatch and his wingmen executed the weave. 1 Zero committed, flew through the crossing pattern, and took a burst of 50 caliber rounds through the cockpit. He fell away, smoking. The right group attacked Sheehy's pair. Same result. The weave held. After 8 minutes, the Japanese had lost 5 Zeros. The Americans had lost 0 Wildcats. The coordinated, brilliant, 3-direction attack had completely failed. The weave was not just a tactic, it was robust. Thatch knew this victory was, in its own way, more profound than Midway. Midway proved the weave worked against a standard attack. Santa Cruz proved it was resilient against an
That's
adapted
5
one.
kills and no losses.
That evening,
A ratio of 8
Thatch
versus
filed a
18,
combat
resulting
report.
in 5 versus
He
0.
described the
math is
3-direction
undeniable.
attack, described
fleet
how the
order,
weave
issued on
held
the
even
14th of
under
April,
coordinated assault,
drastically altered the deployment
and recommended
strategy for the Pacific
immediate,
theater.
mandatory adoption. No more testing, no more evaluation. It worked. period. The report reached Admiral Nimitz on June 25th. Nimitz, now fully convinced, forwarded it to Admiral Ernest King, the iron-willed commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet. King, read it. He read the kill ratios. He read the survival statistics. 0 American losses, 5 Japanese losses, 8 Wildcats versus 18 Zeros. The math was undeniable. On June 29th, Admiral King issued Fleet Order 41 to 1942. All fighter squadrons in the Pacific Fleet would immediately adopt the Thatch Weave as standard combat doctrine. Mandatory training for all pilots. Mandatory execution in all
This muddy
engagements.
scar, Henderson
The
Field,
matchstick
became
trick,
the focal point of the
born
struggle
of
for
desperation in
Guadalcanal.
a San Diego
The
barracks,
jungle offered no quarter.
was now official U.S. Navy tactics. But an order from Washington is not the same as trained muscle memory in a cockpit. Orders
struggle
take
for
time to
Guadalcanal
reach
was a
every
brutal
squadron,
meat grinder,
time
relentless
to train
and unforgiving
pilots,
for all who fought
time
there.
to practice the pattern, and the Japanese weren't waiting. On July 7th, over Guadalcanal, 32 Zeros would attack 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons. Some of those squadrons had gotten the message, some had not.
Here we see the
And the
foundational
ones that didn't
aerodynamics of the
would
late
learn the
50s.
hard way why
Now,
Thatch had been
compare
teaching
that to the
matches for
structural
5
integrity
months.
of the modern
July
Weave.
7th, 1942. The skies over Guadalcanal. This was not just another island. It was the strategic linchpin for the entire South Pacific. The battle for Henderson Field would become a brutal 6-month war of attrition. A meat grinder for men, ships, and aircraft. On this day, Fleet Order 41 to 1942, the directive mandating the Thatch Weave, was still just a piece of paper working its way through the logistical bloodstream of the Navy. In the air over Henderson Field, 12 Wildcats from 6 different squadrons flew a combat air patrol. It was a mixed, ad hoc group, a perfect, tragic cross-section of the Navy's doctrinal transition. 4 of those pilots, having heard the reports from Midway or served with Thatch. The 8 were brave, seasoned pilots, but they were still trapped in the 1918 doctrine of the lone wolf. At 11:20 a.m., 32 Zeros appeared from the north. The 4 pilots who knew the Weave immediately paired up, their movements precise and coordinated. They became two plain defensive units, a system of mutual protection. The 8 who didn't know it did exactly what they had been trained to do. They scattered, turning independently to engage the enemy in traditional 1-versus-1 dogfights. It was exactly what the Japanese pilots wanted. It was a controlled experiment with the most brutal of variables. 22 minutes later, the results were in. 6 Wildcats were shot down, spiraling in flames into the jungle or the Iron Bottom Sound. All 6 were pilots who had fought independently. The 4 pilots using the Weave survived without damage. More than surviving, they had claimed 7 Zero kills between them. The combat report from that engagement was not a request. It was an indictment. It was a tombstone for the old way and a birth certificate for the new. When Admiral Bull Halsey read that report, he saw the numbers not as statistics, but as lives. 6 dead because of inertia, 4 alive because of an idea. Halsey was a man of visceral, immediate action. He immediately issued orders that cut through all bureaucracy. Every fighter pilot in the South Pacific would learn the Thatch Weave within 2 weeks. No exceptions. The revolution was now mandatory. Training programs started on July 10th. Thatch himself, was pulled from combat and flew to Guadalcanal. He was no longer just a squadron commander. He was the fleet's chief instructor, an evangelist for a doctrine of survival. He spent 3 grueling weeks teaching the weave to every squadron on the island. Morning briefings in stifling hot ready rooms, afternoon flight training in the contested skies over Henderson Field, and evening debriefs under mosquito nets. He showed pilots the matches, drew the diagrams on smeared chalkboards, and flew demonstration patterns. The idea was infectious because it worked. Some pilots learned in 2 days. Others, more resistant to abandoning the lone wolf mentality, needed a week. But every pilot learned. The numbers of the converted grew exponentially. By August 1st, 96 Wildcat pilots could execute the weave. By September 1st, 214 pilots. The tactic went viral, spreading from the Pacific to the Atlantic, from carriers to land bases, from Wildcats to other aircraft types. P-38 Lightning squadrons, facing the same problems, started using it. P-40 Warhawk squadrons in the China-Burma-India theater adopted it. Even some B-17 bomber formations adapted the crossing pattern for defensive purposes. The results were immediate and strategically game-changing. The data from the war economy was undeniable. In June 1942, before the weave became doctrine, American fighters had a kill-to-loss ratio of 0.44 to 1 against Zeros. This was a catastrophic failure of attrition. For every 10 American fighters lost, the U.S. shot down only 4 Zeros. By October 1942, after widespread weave adoption, the ratio had inverted to a staggering 2.1 to 1.
As detailed in this manual,
Americans
Thatch
were
Weave
now
provides
shooting
a
down
crucial
2
defensive
Zeros
maneuver,
for
allowing
every
slower
1
Allied
Wildcat
aircraft to counter
lost.
superior enemy
Thatch
fighters.
hadn't just saved pilots. He had fundamentally broken the Japanese air war strategy. The Zero was still faster, still more maneuverable, but it didn't matter. The weave had neutralized agility. It turned the Zero's greatest strength into a fatal trap. Japanese pilots, who had reigned as the undisputed demigods of the sky, now hated it. Their doctrine was shattered. Intercepted radio traffic from September showed Japanese squadron commanders frantically warning pilots about the American crossing pattern. New orders were
By early
issued.
1942,
Do not
the Pacific
commit to
was
tail
dominated
chase.
by the enemy.
Do not
Yet,
follow
from
American
Guadalcanal
fighters
and
into their
Midway,
wingman's guns. Disengage if Americans execute coordination tactics. But disengaging meant losing the fight. It meant letting American dive bombers and torpedo planes through. It meant giving up air superiority. The weave had made it almost impossible for them to get guns on target. And in doing so, it had changed the entire economic equation of the Pacific War. By January 1943, the doctrine born from desperation was now official. Fleet Order 41 to 1,942 was not just a recommendation. It was the law of the sky. The Thatch Weave was now standard doctrine across all U.S. fighter squadrons. The Army Air Force adopted it. The Marine Corps, whose pilots had paid a heavy price in the skies over Guadalcanal, embraced it. The British Royal Navy, struggling with their own vulnerabilities, began training their carrier pilots on it. The tactic that started with 2 matches on a desk in San Diego had become the foundation of Allied fighter doctrine, a tactical intellectual property that had saved the entire air war in the Pacific. In February
As the diagrams
1943,
show, the planned intersection
Thatch
required a
received the Navy
last-second
Cross.
adjustment to avoid
The
catastrophe.
citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the development of fighter tactics that have saved numerous American lives and contributed significantly to the success of U.S. naval aviation operations. But Thatch, a man of engineering precision, didn't care about medals. He cared about numbers. He was haunted by the 43 funerals in early 1942. The new numbers were his only solace. In the 6 months before the Weave, the Pacific Fleet lost 137 Wildcats in combat with Zeros. In the 6 months after the Weave became doctrine, the fleet lost 41. That was 96 pilots who came home. 96 men who would have otherwise been a statistic. A letter home to a grieving family. 96 lives saved because 2 matches could cross paths. But the war machine is impersonal. In March 1943, Fighter Command, recognizing that Thatch's brain was now a more valuable asset than his trigger finger, reassigned him. He was pulled from combat operations and sent back to San Diego to teach the Weave to new pilots. He hated it. He hated being away from the fight, away from his men. But Command was right. He was more valuable as an instructor than as a combat pilot. He was more valuable teaching the trick than just using it. Thatch trained pilots for the next 18 months, becoming the high priest of a new combat religion. He taught the Weave to over 800 naval aviators. Every one of those pilots took that tactic to combat.
Unable to hold their position,
Every
executed a
one of
sharp
them survived
disengagement.
situations
They are now in
they
full
shouldn't
retreat,
have.
attempting to climb and escape
And
the
every
theater
one of
battle.
them told other pilots about the commander who saved their lives with matchsticks. When the war ended in August 1945, Thatch was 40 years old. His combat record was stellar. 73 missions, 6 confirmed kills, the Navy Cross, but none of that compared to the number that truly mattered. By the war's end, it was estimated that over 2,000 American pilots had survived the war because they knew how to weave. After the war, Thatch faced a choice. His wife wanted him home. His children barely knew him. But staying in the Navy meant continuing to teach, continuing to save lives. John Thatch stayed in the Navy. He couldn't walk away from the pilots who needed to survive the next war. He spent the next 27 years developing tactics, leading men, and saving lives without firing a shot. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1960. He commanded carrier groups during the Korean War. He never flew in combat again, but his pilots did, and every one of them knew the Weave. It was in Korea that fighter pilots officially began calling it the Thatch Weave. No other tactic in military history had carried its inventor's name while he was still alive. During Vietnam, the Weave evolved. The geopolitical and technological landscape had changed, but the geometry of air combat remained. American F4 Phantom pilots, in a faster, more complex jet-age war, adapted the Weave for supersonic speeds. They called it the Fluid 4 formation. The principle was identical. They used it against North Vietnamese MiGs. The MiG-17 could outturn the heavy F4, just as the Zero had outturned the Wildcat. But the Weave worked at 600 miles per hour, just as it had at 300. It was a timeless, perfect, tactical solution. Thatch retired from the Navy in 1973 as a 4-star admiral. After 40 years of service, he moved back to San Diego and lived quietly. When reporters asked about the Weave, he was famously humble, almost dismissive of his own genius. It wasn't genius, he always said. It was desperation. I just wanted my boys to come home.
As you can see,
But the
single combat
pilots
is
never
simply too
forgot.
risky.
Every
But the
year on
2v1
February
weave provides
10th,
a distinct,
the
measurable
anniversary of
advantage.
that first combat test, naval aviators from around the country would call Thatch, thank him, and tell him stories of how the weave saved their lives. Thatch listened to every story. In 1981, the Navy named a building after him at Naval Air Station, Pensacola. Thatch Hall, the fighter pilot training facility. Every naval aviator who earns their wings of gold walks past a bronze plaque with Thatch's face and 3 words: innovate, adapt, survive. John Thatch died on April 15th, 2001. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew over 300 naval aviators. Many were in their 70 seconds and 80 seconds. Men who had flown Wildcats in 1943. Men who had flown Phantoms in 1967. Men who had flown Hornets in 1991. All of them alive because one
Now
commander,
that the diagram is fully
in an act of
illuminated,
profound
the true
intellectual
structure of the
empathy,
weave can be
thought
understood.
about matchsticks. Today, the Thatch Weave is still taught at every fighter pilot school in the United States. In the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Thatch's original pack of matches is preserved in a glass case. The label says, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch used these matches to develop the tactical innovation that saved over 2,000 American pilots. School groups walk past that case every day, but fighter pilots always stop. They look at those matches, and they understand.